So today's session, how to assess your church property's potential for development. This topic is one that we spend a lot of time focused on supporting ministries. It's a very risky area, very costly, and it's a focus that, if ministries aren't appropriately equipped, could find themselves in trouble. And so we spend lots and lots of time just educating, teaching best practices, setting up just some processes, and so that when ministries are thinking about developing their property for housing or something else, that there is at least a baseline understanding of how to be successful. So you can keep going. Megan is unfortunately unable to join us, and so I'm going to be hosting today, which I'm happy to do. So a little bit about DCG. This is our 20th year. We are a public benefit corporation, and so we practice mainly in the state of California. And we provide real estate consulting, brokerage, and development services to faith-based entities, mostly churches. And what our offering is unique in that we understand the technical components when it comes to real estate in this context development. But we also, because several of us are ministry leaders, we understand the responsibility of making those decisions often as a trustee. And a lot of times the priorities, the mission, the desired outcome isn't just revenue or profit driven. It's often, how do we have impact? And so there's a balance between using our property to accomplish our ministry objectives, but also making sure that we have the sound fundamentals when it comes to the technical real estate. We've done billions of dollars in transactions and work with thousands of organizations. As a matter of fact, in the state of California, by volume, we're the #1 provider of real estate services for faith-based entities. A little bit about just who we are. Our mission is to help. I'm just going to paraphrase it. Our mission is to help ministries, as it relates to the real estate, be successful. And so your missional outcome then becomes our missional outcome. So we don't have a focus that departs from what you want to accomplish. So based on what your objectives and priorities are, we adopt that as our mission. And we look at real estate as a means to impact the community for social good. As such, we're a certified B Corporation, and that means that we have a triple bottom line. So it's a process that we went through a number of years ago. So yes, we're a for-profit corporation, but a B Corp, for those of you who don't know, operates quasi as a nonprofit as well. So we're not a nonprofit, but we do take on the nonprofit DNA. So we have a social and an environmental mission along with our for-profit status. And that's very important to us. That's core to who we are. Just a little bit about our history and doing training. We've partnered with the San Francisco Foundation, San Francisco Interfaith Council, Glad Tidings Community Development Corporation, Crankstart. Those are Northern California. We have a number of partners in Southern California. We did do a large effort called the Ministry of Housing, and we did 2 in-person all-day conferences, and then we did an online version with the San Francisco Interfaith Council. The notion being, how do we walk through high-level development concepts and also bring together the different disciplines necessary in assembling a team of professionals to walk through that process in reality? And so architects, land planners, financial consultants, legal counsel, and it was very well attended. Those materials are available. I believe you can access those through our website. But just that's something that we're very proud of, because it's just free content that we know helps ministries make decisions when it comes to real estate development. So this is just a plug for that. Our services. So strategic discernment if you were in the for-profit world, we'd call it strategic planning. And it's really understanding where we're going 2 years out, 3 years out, 5 years out, in faith-based content, in the faith-based context, we call that strategic discernment. And we lean on that concept of discernment because it invites the spiritual practice of really understanding what the higher calling is for your ministry. And sometimes ministries do have those internal resources, and sometimes they don't. So in the sense where maybe there's a couple of different competing trains of thought internally. Do we want to do housing? Do we want to do a shelter? Well, a shelter is transitional housing. Do we want to do a food pantry? Do we want to just sell it? Do we want to lease it? Sometimes there could be competing concepts, and bringing in a third neutral, uh, unbiased party to kind of just walk through this process then lands on a shared vision and everyone becomes aligned. So we do offer those services, and those are particularly important when not everyone is on the same page. And not that there's tension, but it's just maybe there's a couple of good ideas and we really don't know which way to go. And so we come in and facilitate that process. We also provide analysis and planning and project management. And that's really technical, where you may have a piece of property, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But there is a technical process and flow that developers go through. You look at land use, you look at the capacity for the site. What can be built there? What are the costs? What are the opportunities? What are the constraints? What is the entitlement process? So we go through that. We offer brokerage services, which is transactional, leasing, selling, and buying. And then asset management is something that we also do, is where you may have assets and you're not really sure how to just make sure that those assets are well taken care of physically, but also financially, where there are good financial disciplines to protect their sustainability. So we offer those services as part of our core suite. Here's a brief photo of some of our core team members. We'll keep going. And today's workshop is going to focus on the development potential. We'll walk through a little bit about discernment, evaluation, building your team, feasibility, etc. Feel free to put questions in chat. So we start off with discernment, and another term again is strategic planning, because when you move into something as serious as development, even at the conceptual stage, it's very important organizationally that there is alignment internally. Alignment internally does not necessarily mean that there is 100% buy-in, because there could just be some folks who just don't want to go in that direction, and there's nothing you can do to persuade them, but it typically means that the majority wants to move in that direction. After you're on the other side of a process in which, if there's a vote, if there's just a temperature, and you get the sense that we want to go in this particular direction. It's very important, because we've also seen the horror stories. And I think of one particular church in the Bay Area where the way that their internal organization made decisions was by congregational vote, and there needed to be 2/3 threshold for a decision to be adopted and action taken. And there was a process that led to that congregational vote, meetings and information, and then ultimately the vote, which we participated from the beginning of. It was introduced by some of the leaders that they wanted to develop housing. The church needed the revenue from the future housing to help them become financially sustainable over the long term. And there was just a lot of momentum. The pastor, the leaders, and the majority of the congregation just wanted to go in that direction. And based on the condition of the property physically, based on their financial health at the time, I also thought this could be a really, really good solution for them, because it also would have been missional type of housing. So it wasn't like market housing. And they had a congregational vote. They started negotiating with a very well capitalized national developer. And then the bottom fell out of the process. And the reason it did is because there was this remnant within the congregation that were, I would say, the most mature demographic in the church, that also happened to be the longest affiliated members. And over a course of literal decades, the composition of the church changed demographically. And this remnant group kind of just felt disempowered, and they did not want to see any change. And although they had followed appropriately their internal processes to make decisions, it wasn't even close. It was well more than the two-thirds threshold. It was, I want to say 80 or 90%, but that small minority organized and lobbied and went to the press and brought in anti-housing advocates and just basically derailed the entire process. And the church split, a lot of members left, and it was just a very unpleasant outcome at the end of the day. And my key learning from that, which is why I'm taking my time on this slide, is because it is very important to be in alignment. And then if you do have a small minority that just is opposed, taking a little bit more time to hear their concerns, even if it doesn't change the majority, but just honoring their voice. And I think from the case I just gave, that didn't happen. They were raising their hand in opposition, but I think the process didn't allow for their voice and concerns to be heard in a way that they felt valued. And the process just kind of went forward without them. And momentum was fast and everything happened and they organized. Some of the risks is just not understanding the full potential, but I just gave worst case scenario. It was a really bad outcome. So just evaluating what the congregation wants, getting into alignment. And there's a process that we go through. And not doing that, I think, really has some unintended consequences. So just a little bit more about discernment is it's really helping you understand what is the why, right? Why do we meet and then where are we wanting to go? And there is a very prescriptive process that is followed during this. And it's intended to bring all of the voices that are willing to participate into harmony and getting rooted in why are we here? Where do we want to go? What's important? Looking at the history, looking at the needs of the community, both internally and externally. And what does success look like for us as a ministry? So there is a process for that. This was a quote that Father Phil Burchard, he's a pastor in Berkeley. They were successful in building housing, and he was a panelist on one of our workshops, and he talked about believe it deeply, hold it lightly. And what he's really saying is you may really, 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 really believe strongly in a particular position, which is fine, but don't become married to it to the extent that you're not movable, because there needs to be flexibility in the process. There needs to be patience in the process. There needs to be grace in the process, because then with those type of values, the ministry is centered, not necessarily the individual. And then the outcome is really focused on what is in the best interest of the ministry. And sometimes as individuals, we have our biases, we have our opinions, we have our desires, and we really, really may think we're right, but sometimes it may not be just what's in the best interest of the ministry. So we just feel that this quote is really a great anchor. So big picture, and what we're talking about here is just the flow of the development process. We do not believe it goes from inspiration to signing up with a development partner and then you go into construction, which we do see that, but there are unintended consequences along the way. There are a lot of risks. We think you go slow first in order to go fast later. So we start with discernment. That's just making sure organizationally, before there's time spent, resources spent, that the organization of the church has a vision that will carry that body through what's going to be years and also ups and downs along the way, and opportunities where you're inviting risk, potentially financially, organizationally, and having that alignment, that vision, that unity will carry you forward. So that's that discernment. Then we move into, let's say you do have some land and you're thinking about, well, we're interested in development. We also then think there's an opportunity to measure just what is the potential. And this is very early in the process, because sometimes we do see a lot of resources spent on studies or architects or other professionals just to come back and say, well, there's not as much development potential, but there's 50 grand or $100,000 spent just to come back and give you information that's not helpful. So we like to use the term iterative, and that's our initial feasibility. And what we call that is there. So we're looking specifically at a couple of things. We're looking at, is the current land use suitable for development? That's your zoning, your general plan. And if it's currently not, is there a path for that? We're looking at the financial feasibility. Depending on the type of housing desired, there are some financial metrics that can be measured to determine, is it sustainable? And then there's the political environment. So we're looking at these, and it's very cost effective. And there isn't a lot of time spent up front just to make sure that there is a there. And then if there is, then you move forward to spending serious time and then accumulating the resources, because development, like I said, is very expensive and there's a lot of risk. So that's the initial discernment, feasibility, and the conceptualization. It's getting into now, what do we want? And so let's just say someone wants to do affordable housing, family housing, senior housing, some other special needs housing. And then there's starting to be a vision that emerges that now can be measured and managed forward. After that process, then it becomes team building. Who are the folks needed to move this forward? So obviously there's going to be community engagement just to make sure that there's support. And if there's opposition or concern, that those are heard and brought into the process. Who do you want to serve? Any key partnerships? So there is this process then of who are those external relationships that we also need to bring into our universe now, because that's another step. When it gets to feasibility study, development partnership, that's really where a lot of the deep technical work happens. So even though there's been this initial feasibility, it's a high level feasibility that's fairly reliable. But when we get to this feasibility study, development partnership, that middle arrow, that's a lot more technical, because that also now requires like soil studies and environmental surveys and the physical aspects of development, as well as most churches do not have resources to do it themselves. So they need to bring in some type of partnership, especially if it's workforce housing or affordable housing. If it's affordable housing and it's going to use public money, there has to be an affordable housing developer in the relationship, if there's state tax credits in particular, because that's what the state requires. And there could be different developers that have different missions, different personalities. And so you're looking for who's a good culture fit, as well as who understands our vision and who would make a good partner. The owner representative, that's part of the work that we do, but there are others. That's when you are partnering with a developer and you do not have that in-house expertise. The way I like to talk about that is, everyone has a clear notion of when it's appropriate to engage an attorney, right? There are different events that take place, and everyone will know based on those events, oh, we need to bring in legal counsel. And on a development, which often carries substantial risk, there isn't the same general understanding that we also need representation to help guide us and protect us. And that's where the concept of an owner rep. And what that really means is, as you go down this path of development, that you have this, sometimes there's the opportunity to have someone in-house because maybe there's a member that comes from the development community, and that's great. In the event that that doesn't exist, then there are external vendors that you could bring in as a development expert that sits in the church's seat and from the perspective of the church. And now you have a co-equal to the development partner, so that as you're looking at financials and looking at the development plans and looking at the process and going through all the different aspects, that you're appropriately represented, because there are decisions that need to be made and there are commitments that are executed at this stage. And especially if it's subsidized housing, there are some really substantial, I will call them items that need to be negotiated. So just as a quick aside, if you're doing tax credits within 15 years, at the end of 15 years, the tax credit program expires. If you don't know what tax credits are, we might address it at another time, but that's where the state of California provides a funding mechanism for affordable housing. Now, it doesn't fund 100% of construction, but it provides a substantial portion of the capital needed, and that's via a tax credit program. At the end of 15 years, there is a disposition for that property. So if you're assuming you do tax credits because it's affordable housing, you will have an affordable housing developer as your partner. And that depends on the type of relationship you desire to have. In 15 years, that property, there's going to be a decision like who ultimately retains control. That's something that we recommend is pre-negotiated. It's called the syndication period. And I know more than one ministry that was unaware of this. They went into a development deal with a nonprofit, and in 15 years, I know at least in one case they got a letter. If you want to maintain control, give us this untold number of millions of dollars to buy your property back, which they didn't have, and they lost their property. And so your owner's rep, little things like that, and a whole bunch of others, your owner's rep can prepare you in advance of wherever those different substantial commitments that could have unintended consequences if they're not navigated in a way that you understand what your risks and opportunities are. There's room for risk. And so your owner's rep is the person that will shepherd you through that process. Design and planning, we're way down the road now. We're at the point where we're like tightening up the architectural plans and the engineering studies, and you're working with the city and you're getting ready to submit for a formal development plan, and then construction and operation. So this is the flow of how development works. So just a little bit about your internal development team. Uh, it's really making sure that you have the right people around the table to represent you. Do we have practice of making tough decisions together? Do we expect to have continued congregational capacity? Who can speak for us in conversations with professionals? So that's your internal team, and that's where you're preparing yourself to engage in the relationship. And so sometimes, often, the church will have a small development committee, and it's folks that are charged with you're going to be the church's liaison to this development program. So just making sure that that team is in place so you can have some continuity. And as the institutional wisdom is created, that there is protection of that institutional wisdom. Key steps in the decision-making process, we've already talked about some of this. It's, the discernment and internal alignment. I've touched on that a lot. Uncover real estate needs and resources. It's, and this is where this second bullet, uncovering real estate needs and resources, this is really for ministries that say, we want to build housing on our current site and we're okay reestablishing our meeting space and our worship space within the new development. And that's where you're making sure that the needs of the ministry are contemplated and embedded in the future plan. And there's a process for going through to protect what the ministry may need. Again, identifying your leaders and partners. I think I touched on it a little bit, but it's who internally will be our champions, and then making sure that you have your vendor team in place as well. Site feasibility is pretty straightforward. This is not something that the church will be driving, but you will be the recipient of this information, and it also needs to be appropriately translated. And so this slide is just intended to demystify what happens between the time you say we're interested in development and then all of a sudden someone brings you a very pretty picture of a rendering. Here's what it could look like, and here's how many units. And we've all seen those drawings of a rendering of a future development. Well, what goes into that? And we just thought it was important to make sure that you understand that. So the site constraint analysis is looking at the physical site itself and determining what's physically possible. And that, in other words, how many units can we develop here? And that's governed by local land use, city or county, and it looks at how many units per acre, what are the roads and access, what are the setbacks, what is the landscaping, does there need to be open space? And there's this formula that architect will go through to land on, okay, this site will allow us to develop 50 units or 120 units. The land use analysis is also taking in the information that the city already has established, where We're looking at local zoning, we're looking at the general plan, and what is most likely to be supported. Sometimes we will go in and look at the current land use, that's the actual in place city code or ordinance, and it's not zoned for housing. But after conversation with planning staff and maybe council members or the mayor or supervisors, we learn philosophically that they would love to see that property become housing. So although the existing land use isn't conducive, there is a political will to change the zoning. So we uncover that. And then the financial analysis is where you're literally looking at how much does it cost to build? Where are those sources coming from? How much does it cost to operate? Does it pay for itself? And then you learn the property's economically feasible or is not. So these are all part of the early stage feasibility that we talked about, but we just wanted to kind of break it apart a little bit. Site constraints, we don't need to spend too much time, but this is where, there has to be access for fire and safety. So there will be a certain amount of land area set aside for fire lanes and turnarounds and also how is the site configured? What architects are often doing is wanting to maximize the shape. So obviously, if you have a perfect rectangle, then it's a really, really straightforward development. But if you have like an odd shaped lot, then you can, because you're not going to have an odd shaped building, then it's not as efficient. But they're looking at how do we maximize the developable area. If there are existing structures, there's cost. If there are environmental hazards, floods, the soil, some other, compound that just creates environmental risks. Those are all studied. I'm just looking at this list. Topography really is the contours of the land itself and water, grading, and the surrounding context. So these are technical things that go into the process of landing on. Here is, I would say, either the maximum density or the most efficient way to lay out a development. Some of these are fixed, but some of those are flexible, just depending on the team that you have. This is just site constraint analysis. This is just really getting deeper into what architects do. These are sometimes by hand or sometimes by computer. This is just really the building process of how do they land on that. So we can just kind of skip past this slide. Land use analysis we've touched on, but it's really the city's ordinance for what uses. Do we want housing? If we do want housing, is it low density? Is it high density? Industrial? And just all the various components that drive the local land use ordinances. And so there's a lot of time spent up front understanding what those opportunities are, understanding if there are constraints. If there are constraints, can they be mitigated? So for instance, maybe the church itself, let's just say, is in an industrial area and is surrounded by heavy industry. They may say, we don't want to see housing there just because there may be some other environmental risks and we don't think we want to see housing there. So that's an example, which is context in the community or some other non-compatible use. But what we're looking for are things that support housing because the goal is to develop housing we're talking about development. And so the land use component is where there's a lot of time and attention spent, both what is existing ordinance and also what the potential could be. Financial analysis we've touched on, but typically this is where you have another part of the team who is a financial consultant, and they look at cost estimation, construction values, where are the different pots of money. So city may have money, the county may have money, there may be foundations or other organizations that are prioritizing housing and they want to put their money there, the state, special grants, and then revenue models it's rental income and lease income and partnership income and operating subsidies. And then just looking at it from how does that align with the church's needs and the long-term impacts and what are the risks? So that's a model. You may hear the term pro forma. And what a pro forma does is it really lays out what is the construction budget, where are those dollars going to come from to pay for construction, and then there's the income and the expense, and then what's left over, and the reserves, and how is all that sustainable. So there's a financial analysis that takes place. Again, part of these seminars, webinars, educational opportunities is equipping you to understand these things, because prior to organizations like ours that are prioritizing these type of sessions, ministries just had no idea. So they typically, and this is my experience over the last 20 years, a lot of times would sign these partnerships with just not understanding what are the financials, what are the opportunities, what are the constraints, what are the risks, and they go in blind. And you may even know, I don't want to make this negative, but it's good to know upfront all the details to the extent possible before you make a commitment. Demand is really a part of the type of housing. Is there a demand? What is the demographic for the demand? Are the developers? So for instance, there are certain communities that have, I'm using affordable housing as an example. There are certain communities that have a serious need for more units. San Francisco as an example, Los Angeles as an example. So we know that there is a constituency that is seeking housing as a tenant, and we know that there are developers that are looking for opportunities to develop. And then you may have other communities that have an overabundance of housing. They don't have enough market housing. So maybe there isn't as many folks in line to get the units, and developers may say, we're not really looking in those areas. We're looking in areas where there's a higher need. So there is a process to determine. This just goes into feasibility of, is housing appropriate and likely to be successful at a given location. Professional partners, this is very important. And it's really understanding who the development team is. And the reason we talk about this is because we think it's important for the church to have at least an owner's rep. And depending on the type of relationship you have with the developer, just understanding who those different members of the development team is, what are best practices with hiring, because we always talk about the competence, which is the technical proficiency, but we also talk about conscientiousness. So you want someone that you can trust, but we also talk about culture and character, that they actually fit. And so it's important to understand those different dynamics before you hire someone, because you're going to be as strong as your weakest link. And the team that you hire is going to have a lot to do with your ability to be successful. Some of the key folks, and I've talked about this throughout this session, the development consultant, that could be your owner's rep or something similar. That's the person who understands development and they're putting the pieces together. So I'll use an example of a real life scenario. Pastor AG, he's in West Oakland, Friendship Church. He wanted to develop senior housing on the church site. And as a pastor, he had no experience in housing development, but he had the vision and the calling to do such. So he retained us because we became his development consultant. So we helped do the initial pre-development feasibility that we talked about earlier. We brought in a financial consultant to perform the economic and financial analysis. We brought in an architect to help understand land use and capacity and the physical feasibility. And we kind of quarterbacked that entire team to help Pastor AG understand what is his opportunity, or the church's opportunity, how much is it going to cost, what is it going to look like, and at the end of the day, do you have the potential for a successful project or not? But he didn't know who to call. He didn't understand who was qualified or not. So because that's what we did, or that's what we do, we knew which architect to bring in, which financial consultant to bring in, and other people so we put together a team for him. And they should be finished with construction by now. So he started with just this vision, brought in his consultant. We brought in the rest of the team, including the affordable housing developer, and they just sprinted. They were able to put together the funding. They received all their approvals. I think they broke ground late last year, and they should be finished by now. I haven't checked lately, but I need to, because it's a great success story. But that's just talking about these three folks here. What we think this is the nucleus to get you started and to move you into the next phase, which would be now who's your development partner, and then your development consultant where initially we'll do a lot of the work. As the development partner comes on board, then it becomes part of their operation, and your development consultant, there should be kind of like this toggling where your development consulting initially is doing a lot of work, but then as the partner comes in, then their team takes over. I'm glad you were able to join us, and have a wonderful day.